See if I've learned my lesson here. Did I do that properly? Well, it's great to be back this morning. I hope everyone rested well. We had a great breakfast and a great time of fellowship last night. I enjoyed a number of conversations in both the small group I attended and then a number of informal conversations I had with some of you later in the evening. It's been a great weekend. I want to focus our attention, though, on the topic of passing it on today. Let me just review briefly what I said last night as a way of introducing today's topic. Last night I spoke about the disproportion between male and female participation in the life of the Christian church, and I think most of you acknowledge that. I then went on to argue that I think it's more difficult for males to understand and live the Christian faith than it is for females. And I don't think I heard any real objections to that, but maybe you're still chewing that one over. But I also argued that Jesus is, for us, the perfect example of what it is to be a manly man. And Jesus obeyed the will of God regardless of the consequences. He demonstrated through his obedience what it means to have real power. And that's what I'd like to reflect on today, because it's come to my attention in a number of different ways, and I'll talk about some of these in the next few minutes. It's come to my attention in the last few months how much power men have. The problem is we just don't realize it. We have an incredible amount of power in all kinds of different ways. We have power to impact others' understanding of the Christian faith without saying a word. Let me talk a little bit about this. I want you to think about the language we use about God. I have an experiment that I run in one of my classes. I get all of my students to give me adjectives that describe God. And I write them on the board. So I get things like loving, forgiving, judgmental, jealous, all-knowing. We write all of these up on the board. And then I ask students to tell me which of those characteristics tend to be associated with females and which tend to be associated with males. And then the fighting begins. Particularly over terms like all-knowing and the like. Anyhow, if you do that, you'll see that you come out about 50-50. There are about half of the characteristics of God that are feminine, and about half the characteristics that are masculine. But then I ask my students to give me the names of God and titles for God. And that's a very different discussion. Because all of the titles for God are masculine. Ancient Israel decided many years ago not to use neutral language. It wanted to use personal language. But instead of using sexual language, which was very common in the ancient Middle East, what they now decided to do was use royal language. So they talked about their God in terms of a king or of a lord. They also used terms like shepherd. And they also use terms like father. Now we know that God is not a man. Or at least I think most of us recognize that God is not a man. God's above sexuality. But we use man language to describe God. Our language about God is metaphorical. It's metaphorical. God is like a father. But most people don't recognize that, and the result is that most people associate God with Father. And that is both a privilege and a tremendous responsibility that we have. My experience with a father shaped my Christian life. My father was a significant role model for me. He never graduated from high school, but he was faithful to my mother. I never doubted my father's love for me, and he loved the Presbyterian Church. In fact, the greatest accomplishment of his life was being asked to be an elder in the Presbyterian Church in which I belong. That was a remarkable testimony to me. So when I hear the word Father, I understand very much that God is a loving God, that God is forgiving, and God is gracious, and God is generous. I understand all of that because that, to me, is what a father is. But how about those people whose father was an abusive tyrant? What about a father who was judgmental and whose judgmental side overshadowed any kind of gracious side? What about a father who withheld love? For many people, that's their image when they hear a father. How we live our lives, whether we like it or not, affects other people's understanding of the Christian faith. I'm also very, very persuaded these days about the importance of personal appearance. Men have a tremendous, tremendous power simply by showing up. This point was driven home to me in really sort of a strange way, and I'm embarrassed even to say this, but I had a student about 10 years ago, Joe Verity. I remember Joe very, very well. Joe was one of the most mediocre students I'd ever heard. I'd ever taught. Joe was obviously bright. Joe participated in class. Joe was engaged in the subject matter. And every time Joe took an exam or wrote a paper, it was incredibly average. So I gave him a C. Well, he took another course from me, which surprised me because I didn't think he did so well in the first one. He took another course from me, exact same engaged student and the like, another C. He took a third course from me, and I was sure he was going to get at least a C. Well, another C. Well, I saw Joe shortly before graduation. I said, Joe, you're a mystery to me, and I'm not grading you this semester, so you can really be honest with me. You're almost ready to graduate. I just want to know why you are such an average student. And I looked at his transcript, and everyone else thought he was average too. The guy had probably a 2.2 average out of a 4.0, just above a C average. I said, Joe, you're bright. It seems to me you're interested. What is the problem with you? Why don't you work harder? And Joe said, he said, part of the problem is that I've never read a single assignment in college. He then went on to admit that he'd never purchased a textbook. Now, instead of being really depressed by this student, I was actually impressed. How did he do that? What was the secret of his success? So I said, Joe, how did you, in fact, graduate so well, never having read an assignment? And he said, very simply, I never missed a class. And that's true. Joe had never missed a class. In his 4 years at Gettysburg College, the only thing he did was show up. And he ended up graduating from college.
What does he do now?
You know, it's funny, I actually Googled him in light of I'm thinking about Joe, and he's a martial arts instructor in the Philadelphia area. He was very involved in that in college, and he's actually turned that into a career. Very personable guy. And I normally don't remember my C students, but Joe is just such a character that I go to a gym, although you wouldn't recognize it by the way I look, but I go to a gym fairly regularly, and one of my instructors is fond of saying 75% of the battle is showing up. And there's something about that. There really is something about getting out of bed and getting to the gym and all of that. So that is 75% of the battle is showing up. I happen to think that 75% of life, and Joe is a good example of this, 75% of life is showing up. And I think in many respects, The Christian faith is all about showing up. Ministers recognize this.